Mud crusted the hem of Cora's skirt before she even laid eyes on the rotting cabin. Jedediah hadn't ordered a partner. He bought a pulse to feed his hens and scrub his pots. He expected quiet servitude. He got a woman who looked at his squalor and saw an empire. Frost crunched under the heavy wooden wheels of the wagon, loud as snapping bones in the thin mountain air. Cora didn't wait for the driver to offer a hand down. She grabbed the splintered side rail, hoisted her skirts, and dropped into the ankle-deep muck of the yard. The air up here tasted sharp. It lacked the heavy, coal-choked smog of the St. Louis garment district she'd fled, replacing it with the biting scent of pine needles, wet dirt, and something distinctly feral. Jedediah stood on the porch. The boards groaned under his boots, visibly sagging beneath his weight. He didn't look like the sturdy, self-reliant pioneer the matrimonial agency had promised. He looked like a man who had been slowly losing a war against the wilderness. His buckskin coat was slick with old, blackened grease. A thick beard hid his jaw, but it couldn't hide the deep, exhausted hollows beneath his eyes. He smelled of rancid bear fat, unwashed wool, and stale chewing tobacco. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, his gaze dropping to her thin cotton dress, her bare, trembling hands, and the single, battered leather trunk the driver unceremoniously dumped in the mud. "You're smaller than the picture," Jedediah finally said. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape, like two stones grinding together. "The picture was 10 years old," Cora replied. Her voice didn't shake, though her knees wanted to. "And you didn't mention the roof was caving in." Jedediah spit a dark stream of tobacco juice into the weeds. "Keeps the snow off. Mostly." He didn't offer to carry her trunk. He turned on his heel and pushed the heavy cabin door open. The hinges screamed. Cora picked up her trunk by the leather handle. The leather bit into her palm. Familiar and punishing, she dragged it through the mud, over the threshold, and into her new life. Inside, the cabin was a sensory assault. The air was stagnant, heavy with the metallic tang of dried blood from old hunts, the sour reek of unwashed bedding, and the acrid sting of wood smoke that couldn't find the chimney. The floor was packed earth, littered with mouse droppings and curled wood shavings. In the corner sat a cast-iron stove. Its surface bubbled with years of boiled-over coffee and burnt fat. Jedediah watched her face from the shadows. He expected tears. He was bracing for a hysterical fit, a scream about the conditions, a demand to be taken back to town. He had spent his last $40 on her carriage ticket. He was flat broke. His traps were coming up empty, and the winter was closing in fast. He needed someone to tend the miserable flock of hens out back, keep a fire going, and let him hunt from dawn to dusk without worrying about the pipes freezing. He needed a farmhand. He didn't have to pay wages. Cora didn't cry. She let the trunk drop with a dull thud. She looked at the filthy stove. She looked at the single bed in the corner, covered in a stiff, graying blanket. She looked at the single window, its glass opaque with grime. Her chest felt tight, a heavy knot of panic rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had worked 14-hour shifts in a factory where girls lost fingers to the looms. She had survived a father who drank his wages and broke furniture. She knew what to do with a mess. She just hadn't expected the mess to be this absolute. "Where's the bucket?" she asked. Jedediah blinked. "What?" "The water bucket. And the lye soap. If I'm going to cook on that stove, I have to find the iron under the grease first." Jedediah pointed a thick, calloused finger toward a dented tin pail near the door. "Creek's 50 yards out back. Chop the ice if it's frozen over." He lingered for a second, a strange, uncomfortable itch working its way up his spine. Her lack of fear felt like an accusation. He grabbed his rifle from the wall. "I'm checking the lower trap line. Feed the chickens. Grains in the barrel." He didn't say goodbye. He just walked out, the door slamming shut and rattling the loose, chinking between the logs. Left alone, Cora exhaled. The sound was ragged. She walked over to the table, a slab of rough-hewn pine, and picked up a dirty tin mug left sitting there. A crust of mold floated in the dregs of ancient coffee. For a long, dangerous moment, she wanted to throw herself on the dirt floor and scream. Instead, she threw the mug against the stone fireplace. It clattered loudly, denting, but refusing to break. "Right," Cora muttered to the empty room. "Won't even let me have that." She grabbed the bucket, wrapped her thin shawl tight around her shoulders, and went out into the biting wind to find the creek. She checked the chicken coop first. It was a miserable structure of warped boards and brittle, rusted wire. Inside, 5 scrawny hens huddled together, their feathers dull and patchy. The smell of ammonia was eye-watering. The grain barrel was nearly empty, holding only a few handfuls of dusty oats mixed with weevils. Cora stared at the pathetic birds. They looked back at her with flat, reptilian eyes. "Don't look at me like that," she told them, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "I'm trapped here too." Jedediah stayed gone for 3 days. It wasn't intentional. He got tracked by a mountain lion near the ridge and had to hole up in a rocky outcropping, freezing and chewing on strips of hard, tasteless jerky. When he finally trudged back down into the valley, his muscles screaming and his fingers numb, his traps had yielded exactly 1 scrawny marten. Its pelt would barely fetch 80 cents. As he crested the final hill, he looked down at his property, expecting the worst. He figured the fire would be dead. He figured the woman would be frozen, or worse. She would have hiked down the trail to the mining camp to beg a ride back east. Instead, a thick, steady plume of white smoke curled from the stone chimney. Jedediah frowned. He walked down the incline, his boots slipping on the scree. As he pushed open the cabin door, he stopped dead in his tracks. The smell hit him first. The sour, rancid odor of his own decay was gone. In its place was the sharp, clean bite of wood ash, boiled water, and roasted meat. The floor had been swept so hard the packed earth looked like polished stone. The window let in actual sunlight, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The cast iron stove was black again, stripped of its greasy armor, radiating a fierce, steady heat. Cora stood at the table. She wore one of his old, oversized flannel shirts over her dress to protect it. The sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her forearms were covered in angry red burns and fresh scratches. She was kneading dough, pressing her body weight into the dense, pale lump. She didn't stop working when he walked in. "Wipe your boots," she said. Jedediah stared at her. Then he looked at the stove. Sitting on top was his heavy iron Dutch oven, and from it wafted a smell that made his empty stomach violently contract. Chicken. His head snapped up. "Did you kill one of my layers?" "I killed the oldest one," Cora said, not missing a beat with the dough. "It had scale on its legs. It wasn't laying, and it was eating the feed the younger ones needed. It was useless." "Those were for eggs," he roared, stepping into the room, forgetting to wipe his boots. "You don't kill the livestock because you're too lazy to eat beans." Cora stopped kneading. She slowly wiped her flour-coated hands on a rag. She turned to face him, and the absolute dead-eyed calm in her expression made the breath stall in his chest. "There were no beans, Jedediah. There was half a sack of weevil-infested flour, a jar of salt, and 3 potatoes sprouting eyes in the root cellar. I looked for your stores. I looked for the winter rations a man is supposed to lay up." She took a step toward him, her chin tipped up. "I found your ledger instead." Jedediah's jaw tightened. He felt a hot flush of shame creeping up his neck, manifesting as sudden, defensive rage. "You got no business in my papers. You owe the bank in town $60. You owe the trading post $22. Your winter trapping contract was canceled by the fur company 3 months ago," Cora stated, her voice unnervingly flat. "You didn't need a wife to tend the chickens. You needed a miracle to keep you from starving to death before January." Jedediah threw his meager marten pelt onto the table. It landed with a pathetic slap next to her dough. "I provide for my own. I know the woods. You don't know a damn thing about surviving up here." "I know math," Cora fired back. "And I know a bankrupt man when I see one. Sit down and eat the bird before it goes cold." He wanted to throw the pot out the window. He wanted to yell until she cowered. But the smell of the rich, salty broth broke his pride. He sat heavily in the wooden chair, his knees popping. Cora served him. The meat was tough, requiring aggressive chewing, but the broth was thick, flavored with the sprouted potatoes and wild onions she had dug out of the frozen ground. Jedediah ate with brutal efficiency, staring at his bowl, refusing to look at her. It was the best meal he had eaten in 6 months. It made him hate her a little bit. The silence that night was suffocating. They strung a piece of stiff canvas across the center of the room. Jedediah slept on his cot. Cora slept on a pallet she had made near the stove from old feed sacks and her own meager blankets. He lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the roof. He listened to her breathing, soft and rhythmic on the other side of the canvas. He had wanted isolation. Now he had an auditor in his home, a woman who had unraveled his failures in 3 days and served them to him in a bowl. The next morning, the sound of pickaxes woke them. A quarter-mile above the cabin, the main trail cut through the pass, leading toward the silver claims at Black Ridge. Usually, Jedediah ignored the transient miners. They were loud, dirty, and prone to stealing loose tools. Cora didn't ignore them. She stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, watching a group of 3 men trudge up the muddy incline. They looked exhausted, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Jedediah came out behind her, carrying an axe. "Get inside. Those men ain't polite company." Cora didn't move. She turned her head slightly. "How much do they pay for a hot meal at the Ridge Camp?" "Too much. 10 cents a plate for slop." "Why?" Cora looked back at the miners, her eyes narrowing in cold calculation. "I baked 3 loaves of bread this morning. I have half a pot of chicken broth left." Jedediah stopped, resting the heavy axe head on the porch boards. "No, absolutely not. I ain't running a soup kitchen." "You aren't running anything," Cora said sharply. "You're chopping wood. I'm running a business." Before he could grab her arm, she stepped off the porch. She walked straight to the edge of their property line, where it met the trail. She didn't wave or smile. She stood tall, her posture rigid, and called out, her voice cutting clearly through the thin air. "Hot bread and meat broth. 5 cents. Jedediah watched in horror as the 3 miners stopped. They looked at each other, then down at the severe-looking woman, standing in the mud holding a steaming loaf of bread wrapped in a clean rag. The smell drifted up the hill. One of the men, his face black with soot, scrambled down the bank. He fumbled in his heavy wool coat and pulled out a dull silver nickel. Cora took the coin. She handed him a thick slice of bread, hollowed out in the center and filled with hot, thick broth. The man took a bite, closed his eyes, and groaned. The other 2 miners immediately started down the hill, digging in their pockets. Jedediah stood on the porch, his knuckles white around the axe handle. He felt emasculated. He felt furious. But as Cora walked back up the steps 15 minutes later, she didn't look triumphant. She looked exhausted. She walked past him, went to an empty tin coffee can sitting on the clean shelf, and dropped 3 silver nickels into it. The metal clinked loudly in the quiet cabin. 15 cents, Cora said to the wall. Only $59.85 to go. Ice formed on the inside of the window panes by mid-November. It didn't look like delicate lace. It looked like thick, opaque scabs of frozen breath and rendering steam. The cabin perpetually smelled of boiling suet, strong chicory coffee, and wet wool. Cora's operation grew like a stubborn weed. The 3 nickels turned into $1. The dollar bought a 50-pound sack of flour from a freighter whose wagon threw a wheel down the ridge. Cora fed the freighter for 3 days while he fixed his axle, trading hot elk stew for the flour, a sack of dried apples, and a cracked cast-iron skillet he didn't want to haul. Jedediah watched the transformation with a sour, silent resentment that slowly curdled into confusion. His sanctuary was gone. 4 to 6 men stopped daily. They tracked gray slush onto the packed earth floor. They smelled of unwashed bodies and dynamite powder. They stared at Cora. That was the part that tightened Jedediah's jaw until his teeth ached. They stared at her, not with lust. She was too severe, too exhausted, her hair permanently smelling of fried onions, for that but with a hollow, hungry reverence. She was the only woman within 30 miles who wasn't working the saloons in the lower camp, and she was keeping them alive. He stopped trapping for furs. The market was dead anyway. He became a butcher for his own wife's kitchen. He spent his days chest-deep in powder snow, tracking mule deer and stringy mountain sheep, dragging the heavy, bleeding carcasses back to the porch. He swung the cleaver until his shoulders burned, chopping bone and sinew to feed the perpetual iron pot on the stove. One evening, the door bolted against a howling blizzard. The cabin fell into a heavy, exhausted quiet. Jedediah sat by the fire, sharpening his hunting knife with a wet whetstone. The rhythmic shh filled the small space. Cora sat at the pine table. She was trying to mend a miner's torn canvas coat by the light of a single tallow candle. She charged 10 cents a patch. Jedediah watched her from the corner of his eye. She missed the eye of the needle 3 times. Her hands were shaking. He stopped the whetstone. He looked closer. Her knuckles were split open, the skin red and raw from plunging her hands into freezing lye water day after day to wash out the tin bowls. Deep fissures tracked across her joints, oozing clear fluid and a little blood. She gritted her teeth, wiping a smear of blood off the canvas before it could stain, and tried to thread the needle again. Jedediah stood up. The chair scraped loudly. He walked to his small wooden crate of supplies, dug around, and pulled out a small dented brass tin. He walked over to the table and dropped it hard onto the wood. It landed with a sharp clack. Cora jumped, dropping the needle. She looked up, her eyes defensive, ready for an argument. "Open it," he grunted. She hesitated, then pried the lid off. It smelled awful, musky, and thick. "Badger fat mixed with willow bark," Jedediah said, his voice flat, staring at the far wall instead of her. "Rub it in. Thick. Wrap your hands in rags tonight." Cora stared at the yellow grease. "I don't have time to sit with my hands wrapped. The bread dough needs turning before dawn." "I'll turn the damn dough," he snapped. He finally looked down at her, his dark eyes fierce. "You bleed in the stew. The men won't pay. Grease your hands." It was the most pragmatic, unromantic thing a man could say. It was also a lie. The miners would have eaten the stew out of a boot if she handed it to them. Jedediah knew it. Cora knew it. She looked at his face, seeing the hard lines of exhaustion around his mouth, the grease stains on his shirt from butchering the meat that kept her business running. The hostility in his voice was a thin, brittle shell over something he didn't know how to name. Cora dipped her fingers into the tin. The fat was cold, but as she worked it into her cracked skin, the stinging stopped, replaced by a deep, numbing relief. "You'll punch the dough down hard," she said softly, not looking at him. "Don't tear it. Just punch it." "I know how to hit something," he muttered, turning back to the fire. January didn't just arrive. It broke the territory in half. Snow didn't fall gently, it drove sideways. A relentless, blinding wall of white needles that swallowed the trail entirely. For 3 weeks, no one came down from the ridge. No one came up from the valley. The cabin was utterly cut off, buried under 4 feet of ice and packed powder. The silence returned to the mountain, but it wasn't the suffocating, hostile silence of Cora's first day. It was a heavy, shared weight. They existed in the small radius of heat generated by the stove, prisoners to the weather. The cabin smelled of drying boot leather, wood smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of stored apples turning soft in the cellar. On the 22nd day of isolation, the wind stopped screaming. The quiet left a ringing in Cora's ears. She took the large, dented coffee tin down from the high shelf. It was heavy, the metal dug into her scarred palms. She carried it to the pine table and dumped it. Coins cascaded across the rough wood with a harsh, metallic clatter: copper pennies, tarnished nickels, silver dimes, a few heavy silver dollars, and a handful of crumpled, sweat-stained greenbacks that smelled of blasting powder and unwashed bodies. Jedediah sat by the hearth. He stopped whittling the piece of hickory kindling in his hands. The knife rested against his calloused thumb. He watched her. Cora sorted the money with rapid, precise movements. Her hands were fully healed now, though the deep scars at her knuckles stood out stark white against her flush skin. She didn't use a pencil or a ledger. She counted in her head, her lips moving silently, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration. She flattened the greenbacks, smoothing out the creased corners. She stacked the silver dollars into neat, heavy towers. $84.40, she announced. Her voice lacked its usual sharp, commanding edge. It sounded thin, hollowed out by the sheer, bone-deep effort of getting to this number. She divided the pile. She slid a stack of bills and heavy coins across the split grain of the table toward his side. $62. That covers the banknote in town and the trading post ledger. We clear the debt the day the thaw comes. We own the roof. Jedediah looked at the money. It was more hard cash than he had seen in 3 years of breaking his back on the trap lines. It represented thousands of bowls of hot broth, Hundreds of blistered hands, endless cords of chopped wood, and a mountain of butchered meat. It represented the complete, chaotic hijacking of his solitary life. He didn't touch the coins. He just stared at Lincoln's face on a crumpled bill. "Banker ain't holding the note anymore," Jedediah said. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the popping sap in the stove. Cora froze. The remaining stack of copper pennies in her hand slipped, clattering loudly against the table and rolling off into the dirt floor. "What?" "Mining syndicate," Jedediah grunted, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "They bought up all the delinquent land notes in the valley back in late October. Found out from that freighter whose wheel you fixed." He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. "They don't want the $60, Cora. They want the deed. They want the water rights to the creek out back for a hydraulic sluice operation. They plan to wash this whole hill down into the river." The color completely drained from Cora's face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll left out in the frost. She looked at the stove she had painstakingly scrubbed of years of grease. She looked at the dirt floor she had leveled and swept until it was hard as rock. She looked at the thick canvas she had sewn to keep the drafts off his back while he slept. A deep, violent tremor started in her chest. The ghost of the St. Louis factories breathed down her neck, the crushing reality of working yourself to the bone, only to have a man in a suit take the machine away. She had traded her blood, her sanity, and her pride for copper pennies to pay a debt that couldn't be paid. "They'll evict us," she whispered. Her throat felt tight, strangling the words. The panic she had buried deep in her gut on her very first day finally broke the surface, raw and suffocating. "We did all this. We fed their own men. We survived the winter, and they'll just ride up here in the spring and take it." "No." The word was sharp, absolute. It hung in the air, like the crack of a rifle. Jedediah stood up. He walked to the heavy oak trunk. He kept pushed against the far wall, the one he always kept locked. He pulled a heavy iron key from his pocket, knelt, and opened the lid. The smell of camphor and old wool drifted out. He dug past his winter gear, past a bundle of old letters he never read, and pulled out a folded piece of thick, heavy parchment, stamped with a seal of red wax. He walked back to the table and dropped it right on top of her neat stacks of silver. Cora stared at the wax. She reached out with trembling fingers and unfolded the thick paper. It crackled in the dry air. It was a territorial charter. "I rode down to the valley settlement 3 days before the big blizzard hit," Jedediah said, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at the frosted window, deeply uncomfortable with her wide, shocked eyes. "Took my best traps. Took the Sharps rifle scope I bought in Denver. Traded them all to the territorial magistrate." Cora read the heavy black ink. It didn't list a private residence. It listed the property as the Ridge Way Station and Supply. "Territorial law," Jedediah muttered, scratching aggressively at his thick beard. "A chartered supply post servicing the mail route and public trails can't be seized by a private syndicate through debt assumption. It ain't a private homestead anymore. It's protected domain. As long as we keep the fires burning and the food hot, the land is ours. They can't touch the creek." Cora read the bottom line. The ownership wasn't listed just in his name. The ink was dry, but the words felt like a brand burned straight into her chest. Jedediah and Cora Cross, proprietors. She traced her thumb over her own name. She had been bought to tend chickens. Now, she was recognized by the territory. "You sold your traps," she said. Her voice cracked, betraying the emotion she was trying so hard to swallow. "You sold your scope. You loved that rifle scope." "Fur market's dead," he repeated gruffly. He shifted his weight, his boots scraping the dirt. "Besides, trapping is a lonely man's game. I ain't a lonely man anymore." He didn't wait for her to cry. He didn't want to deal with the messy, complicated flood of gratitude or relief. He turned his back, grabbing his heavy canvas coat from the peg and throwing it over his broad shoulders. "Where are you going?" she asked, hastily wiping her eyes with the back of her flour-dusted wrist. "Gotta reinforce the chicken coop," he grunted, pulling his felt hat low over his eyes. "Wind took a board off last night. Can't have my business partner's layers freezing to death. We need the eggs for the spring menu." He stepped out into the biting, blinding cold, the heavy door thudding shut behind him, rattling the chinking. Cora sat alone in the quiet cabin. The fire popped in the black stove. She smelled the sharp scent of pine, the lingering aroma of stale coffee, and the faint, musky scent of badger fat on her own skin. She looked at the territorial charter, then at the $84. She didn't smile. A smile was far too small, too fragile for the sheer, brutal victory of it. Instead, she stood up, walked to the barrel, and began to measure out the flour. Spring was coming. The snow would melt, the trails would open, and the miners would be hungry. They had work to do. Did the raw, unpolished partnership between Cora and Jedediah keep you turning the pages? Sometimes survival builds a much stronger, deeper foundation than romance ever could. If you love seeing how they outsmarted the greedy mining syndicate to claim their territory, drop a comment below and let me know your favorite moment. Don't forget to smash that like button. Share this gripping story with your fellow Western drama fans, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible frontier tales.